The fluorescent light above the DMV counter flickered twice before the clerk looked up at me. She didn't say anything at first. She just stared at her screen, then at my face, then back at the screen. Her hand moved slowly toward something beneath the counter, and I remember thinking she probably just dropped a pen. I had been standing in that line for 40 minutes. I had a coffee going cold in my bag and a parking meter ticking down outside. I was not prepared for what happened next. "Ma'am, I need you to step to the side, please." Her voice was perfectly flat. No emotion, no explanation. Just step to the side. "Is something wrong with my application? Someone will be with you shortly." I stepped to the side. I watched 3 people behind me get helped. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Then a man in a gray suit walked through a door I hadn't noticed before. Not a DMV employee, not in that uniform. And he looked at me the way people look at something they've been searching for a very long time. He said, "Are you Wren Calloway?" And I said, "Yes," because I had been Wren Calloway my entire life. He said, "Miss Calloway, the Social Security number on your application belongs to an infant who passed away in March of 1993. The coffee in my bag suddenly felt very far away. My name, the name I was given, the name on every school record and birthday card and lease agreement I had ever signed, was Wren Calloway. I was 29 years old. I worked as a radiology technician at a hospital 40 minutes from the house I grew up in, which was also 40 minutes from the town I had spent most of my adult life trying to quietly escape. My stepfather's name was Boyd. Boyd Calloway. He married my mother when I was 4, and from the moment he did, I understood, in the wordless way that small children understand things, that he wished I wasn't there. He never hit me. I want to say that clearly because when people hear a story like mine, they sometimes assume the worst kind of obvious cruelty, the kind that leaves marks you can photograph. Boyd was more refined than that. His cruelty was administrative. It lived in the way he filled out forms, always listing my mother's name first and then his 2 biological sons, with a pause before he got to mine, as if he had to remind himself I existed. It lived in the college fund he set up for my brothers that he never mentioned to me. It lived in the conversation I accidentally overheard when I was 16, when he told my mother that I was, and I am quoting him exactly because some sentences you never unhear, a financial drain on a family that was never really hers to begin with. My mother said nothing. That was the part that stayed with me. I moved out at 19. Not dramatically, no screaming, no door slamming. I just packed my things over a weekend, while Boyd was at a conference and my mother watched from the doorway of my room with an expression I couldn't read then and still can't read now. For 10 years after that, I built a life. Small and quiet and mine. I rented an apartment. I finished my certification. I made friends who knew me only as the person I had become, not the person Boyd had decided I was. I was, by any reasonable measure, doing fine. Then my mother got sick. It wasn't sudden. It was the long, slow kind of sick that rearranges everything. Her address first, then her routine, then eventually her ability to be alone. She moved in with Boyd, which she had never stopped living with anyway, and I started driving the 40 minutes every other Sunday because she asked me to and because no matter what Boyd thought of me, she was still my mother. That's why I needed the updated license. The hospital had changed their credentialing system and I needed a real ID, which meant a trip to the DMV, which meant digging out documents I hadn't looked at in years. My birth certificate, my social security card, my passport application from when I was 22. I had all of them in a manila folder. I had waited in line. I had done everything correctly. And then the man in the gray suit said my social security number belonged to a dead infant, and the room tilted slightly, and I grabbed the edge of the counter because it was the closest solid thing. His name was Agent Ferraro. He walked me to a room with no DMV posters on the walls and sat across from me at a small table and explained, in the careful, measured way of someone who has delivered difficult news before, that my social security number had been flagged in a federal database linked to identity fraud investigations, that the number had originally been issued to a baby girl named Wren Calloway, which was, he said, almost certainly not a coincidence, who had died of a cardiac defect at 11 days old in Baton Rouge, Louisiana in 1993. I was born, according to my own birth certificate, in June of 1995 in Shreveport, Louisiana, to Carol Calloway, née Marsh. "That's my mother," I said. "Carol Calloway." He looked at me for a moment. "We're going to need to make some calls," he said. What followed was 3 days that I am still not sure I have fully processed. Agent Ferraro connected me with a woman from a federal unit I had never heard of. She introduced herself only as Agent Tess, and she had the particular energy of someone who has been doing the same very specific job for a long time and has made peace with all of it. She sat with me in that same small room and she asked me questions about my childhood, my mother. Boyd. When had Boyd entered my life? What did I know about my mother's life before him? Did I know how they met? Did I know where my mother was living when I was born? I knew almost nothing. My mother was not a woman who told stories about herself. I had always assumed that was just her personality, private, contained, a little unreachable. It had never occurred to me to consider whether the privacy was protective. Agent Tess put a photograph on the table. It was a family, a man and woman, maybe late 30s, standing in front of a house with a porch. They were holding a baby. The baby was wrapped in a yellow blanket. "Do you recognize these people?" she asked. I did not. Their names are Franklin and Adele Marchetti. In June of 1995, their newborn daughter was taken from Mercy General Hospital in New Orleans. The baby was never recovered. She paused. The baby's name was Cecilia. I looked at the photograph for a long time. The woman, Adele, was looking at the baby the way you look at something you cannot believe is real. Like the looking itself might be too much. "We'd like you to submit to a DNA comparison," Agent Tess said. "Voluntarily." "Against them?" I asked. "Against their daughter's genetic profile. They submitted samples years ago in case she was ever found." I said yes before she finished the sentence. The results took 9 days. I know because I counted. I went to work. I scanned images of strangers' bones and soft tissue and tried to think about other things. I called my mother twice and she didn't answer either time, which was unusual enough that I noticed it, though I told myself she was tired. I did not call Boyd. On the 9th day, Agent Tess called me at 7 in the morning. She said the DNA was a match. A 99.997% probability match. I sat down on my kitchen floor, not because my legs gave out. I didn't faint. I didn't fall. I just needed to be lower to the ground. I sat with my back against the cabinet under the sink, and I stayed there for a while, and the thing I remember most is that my kitchen was very quiet and very ordinary, and I was not the person I had been 9 days before, and the gap between those two facts felt impossible to cross. I was not Wren Calloway. I was Cecilia Marchetti, the daughter of Franklin and Adele Marchetti of New Orleans, Louisiana. I had been missing for 29 years. There was a cold case file with my name on it. There were people who had spent nearly 3 decades not knowing if I was alive. And somewhere in that 40-minute drive away, in a house I had grown up in, there was a man who knew. I didn't confront Boyd immediately. This is the part of the story where people sometimes say they would have driven straight there, and maybe they would have. But I had spent 29 years being smaller than I needed to be around Boyd Calloway, and I needed a few days to stop being afraid of him before I did anything else. Agent Ferraro and Agent Tess did not encourage me to confront him at all. They were building something, they said. They needed me to be patient. What they were building, I learned gradually, over a series of meetings in a conference room that smelled like burnt coffee, was a case. And the case was not small. Boyd Calloway was not just my stepfather. Boyd Calloway was, at the time of my disappearance, a 27-year-old hospital administrator at Mercy General in New Orleans. He had access to patient records. He had access to the newborn ward. He had, investigators believed, made a deal with a woman named Carol Marsh, who would become my mother, who was then a 22-year-old with a drug problem and a need for money that Boyd was in a position to supply. The theory, which forensic accountants would later confirm with the particular cold certainty of numbers, was this. Carol Marsh took me from Mercy General shortly after my birth and delivered me to Boyd. Boyd had spent 2 years manufacturing a paper trail, a fake birth certificate registered in Shreveport, a social security number pulled from a deceased infant, a story about a relationship and a pregnancy and a daughter who was entirely his. When he married Carol 3 years later, it made everything look more legitimate. A family, a history, a narrative that asked no questions. Why? That was the question I kept asking in that conference room, and the answer, when it finally came, was both more and less satisfying than I needed it to be. The Marchetti family was wealthy. Not quietly comfortable, genuinely, generationally wealthy. Franklin Marchetti had inherited a controlling stake in a regional shipping company from his father, and that company had quadrupled in value by the time I was taken. Boyd Calloway, who had grown up with nothing, who had clawed his way into hospital administration through a combination of intelligence and resentment, had understood something about the Marchetti family that most people didn't. Cecilia Marchetti was the only child, and there was a trust, a substantial one, set up by Franklin's father that was structured in an unusual way. It could not revert to the estate in the event of death, only in the event of confirmed death with a death certificate. A missing child, legally, was in a kind of limbo. The trust could not be dissolved, so Boyd took the child, and then he used the existence of a living, breathing, Social Security number having Wren Calloway me to periodically approach the Marchetti family's attorneys with claims, not direct claims, subtle ones, rumors through intermediaries that the child had been seen, that someone matching her description had been located. Each time, the Marchettis would investigate, find nothing, and the trust would remain frozen. Boyd had never intended to collect. He had intended, forensic accountants explained to me, to keep the trust frozen until Franklin Marchetti died, at which point the legal complexity would make it easier to file a claim on behalf of his fictitious daughter. He had kept me alive for the same reason someone keeps a card they might need to play later. I had spent 29 years believing I was an inconvenience Boyd Calloway was obligated to tolerate. I had actually been a financial instrument he had carefully maintained. I don't know which is worse. I am still deciding. The arrest happened on a Tuesday. I know because I was at work, and Tuesdays I do my longest shift, and my phone buzzed in my pocket at 2014 in the afternoon with a text from Agent Tess that said only, "It's done." What I learned later, because they told me everything afterward with the thoroughness of people who felt they owed me a complete account, was that Boyd had been brought in for questioning the previous Friday. He had come voluntarily, with an attorney, confident enough to be cooperative. He was that kind of man, confident. He had been running this specific deception for nearly 3 decades and nothing had ever surfaced. He believed in his own architecture. What he did not know was that while he sat in the interview room being cooperative, agents were executing a warrant on his financial records, all of them. The accounts in his name, the accounts in my mother's name, a third set of accounts, in the name of a property management LLC he had registered in 2011 that neither of them had ever mentioned to me. He also did not know that my mother had already spoken to investigators. For 3 hours, on the Thursday before his arrest, Carol Calloway, Carol Marsh, had sat in a room much like the one I had sat in and told federal agents everything. Not because she was brave, she told me this herself later, and she was not making herself a hero in the telling. She told them because she was terrified and because Agent Tess had made very clear that the only way to separate her situation from Boyd's was to cooperate now, completely with nothing held back. My mother had not taken me from that hospital because she wanted a child. She had done it because Boyd paid her $20,000 and told her she would be safe with him. She had believed him. And then she had spent 29 years trapped in a story she couldn't leave, raising a child she had stolen, watching a man she feared use that child as a pawn in a game she didn't fully understand. She was not innocent. I am not claiming she was. But when she sat across from me in a visitation room 6 weeks after Boyd's arrest, orange jumpsuit, no makeup, looking more like herself than she ever had in that house. She said, "I'm sorry I watched him. I should have looked at you instead." I didn't forgive her that day. I didn't say I forgave her, but I didn't leave either. I stayed in that chair and I listened, and maybe that was something. Boyd's attorney was good. I'll give him that. He came in with 3 strategies and deployed them in sequence like a man with a playbook he trusted. First, he argued chain of custody on the DNA evidence. That was dismissed in 2 hearings. Second, he argued that the statute of limitations on certain charges had run out, that events from 1995 were too old to prosecute in the way the government intended. The prosecutor's response to this was something I had to read twice to fully appreciate. She argued, and the judge, a woman named Judge Alderman, who had the expression of someone who had seen every possible variety of human audacity, agreed that the kidnapping had never legally terminated. Boyd had continued to exercise control over my identity, my documents, and my legal existence right up until the day I walked into the DMV. Every year he filed taxes claiming me as a dependent. Every renewal of the fraudulent birth certificate was a new act. The statute of limitations clock, she argued, had never started because the crime had never stopped. Boyd's attorney had no good answer for that. Third, and this was the one that I watched from the gallery with something close to disbelief. Boyd himself took the stand, against his attorney's advice, apparently. He stood up there and he said that Carol had acted alone, that he had been deceived, that he had believed I was Carol's biological child and had only discovered the truth recently and had been, in his words, actively working to determine the right course of action. The prosecutor asked him, quietly, why his LLC had received wire transfers from a Marchetti family account in 2009. Boyd said he didn't know what she was referring to. She showed him the wire transfer records. He said he would need to review them with counsel. She said he would need to review them with counsel. She said, of course. And then she showed him 14 more. The jury was out for 6 hours. The verdict was guilty on all counts. Kidnapping, identity fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy. 4 additional counts related to the Marchetti trust scheme. The sentence was handed down 3 months later, and I was in that courtroom for every minute of it, sitting next to a woman named Adele Marchetti who held my hand so tightly I lost feeling in 2 fingers and did not move away. Adele is my mother. I have been trying, slowly and imperfectly, to understand what that means. She is 61 years old, and she has gray in her hair that wasn't there in the photograph from 1995, and when she looks at me, she still has that expression, like the looking itself might be too much. Franklin came to the sentencing too. He is quieter than Adele, more careful with words. He shook my hand when we first met, formally, and I understood that he was afraid of overwhelming me, and I found that, I don't know, tender. A large man being careful with something small. They have a house in New Orleans. They have a guest room. I have been there twice now. The trust, which had been frozen for 29 years, was released to me. I will not say the number because it is not the point, but it is enough that I no longer think about parking meters in the way I used to. I kept my job at the hospital. I needed to keep something that was mine before all of this. Boyd is serving 22 years. He will be in his mid-70s when he is released, if he is released. His confidence, from what I'm told by people who have seen him in the months since sentencing, has not entirely left him. I believe that. It was always the most indestructible thing about him. My mother, Carol, pled guilty and is serving 7 years. I visit her. Not every week, but I visit. There is one thing I have not mentioned yet because I am still not sure how to say it clearly. The day the man in the gray suit told me my social security number belonged to a dead child, my first thought was not fear. My first instinct, and I have never told anyone this, but it's true, was relief. Not because I wanted the life I have now, which I couldn't have imagined then, but because somewhere, underneath everything Boyd had ever said to me about what I cost and what I was worth and how little I had ever belonged, I had always known something was wrong. I had always felt the particular wrongness of a story that doesn't match the teller's face. When the clerk looked at her screen and went still and reached under the counter, part of me, some small, exhausted 29-year-old part of me, thought, finally, here it comes. The part where the real story starts. I was Wren Calloway for 29 years. Boyd built her. He named her after a dead child and gave her a number and sent her out into the world to serve a purpose she never knew she had. But I was always Cecilia. That part he couldn't touch. The part of you that persists underneath the name someone else chose. He had no access to that, no matter how long he tried. I am still learning what Cecilia means. I am 29 years behind on that project. But I have time. And for the first time in my life, I know who I am looking for. People ask me sometimes what the hardest part was. They expect me to say the DNA results, or the courtroom, or the first time I sat across from Adele and didn't know what to call her. But the hardest part was simpler than any of that. The hardest part was realizing that I had spent 29 years apologizing for existing inside a story that was never mine to begin with. Boyd built that story carefully. He was an intelligent man. I'll never take that away from him because denying it would let him off the hook in a strange way. Stupid men don't sustain a deception for 3 decades. He understood systems. He understood paperwork. He understood that if you give a person a name and a number in a family that plausibly fits, most people will never look closer. He bet his entire future on the fact that nobody looks closer. And for 29 years, he was right. What he didn't account for, what I don't think he was capable of accounting for, is that the things you do in the dark have a way of compounding. Every fraudulent tax filing was another thread. Every wire transfer to that LLC was another thread. Every year he kept me in that house, kept me documented, kept me technically alive as Wren Calloway, another thread. He thought he was maintaining his story. He was actually building a case against himself, one careful, arrogant decision at a time. By the time the DMV clerk's hand moved under that counter, there were enough threads that no amount of good lawyering could pull them all out. That's the thing about choosing deception as a long-term strategy. It requires you to be perfect indefinitely. And nobody is perfect indefinitely. Boyd wasn't. Carol wasn't. The cracks were always there. I just wasn't in a position to see them yet. I think about Carol sometimes in a way that's harder to explain. She made a choice at 22 that she spent the next 3 decades paying for in a currency she hadn't anticipated. She thought she was surviving. She ended up trapped. I'm not excusing what she did. She took me from people who spent 29 years not sleeping right, and that cost is real, and it belongs to her. But I understand now that people who make catastrophic choices are rarely thinking about the 29-year version of that choice. They're thinking about the next 3 months. Boyd understood that about her, and he used it, which is its own kind of crime. What I keep coming back to in the quieter moments is this. I had no information. I had no power. I had no name that was actually mine. And I still made it to 29, intact enough to walk into a DMV and accidentally blow the whole thing open. Not because I was brave. I wasn't doing anything brave. I needed a real ID for a credentialing system update at work. But I had spent 2 decades building a life that was small and honest and genuinely mine, and that life required documentation, and the documentation didn't hold. The truth has a way of requiring maintenance that lies don't. I didn't find Boyd out. His own architecture found him out. I was just standing there when it collapsed. I am still learning what Cecilia means. I have a guest room in New Orleans that has been offered to me more than once, and that I have visited twice and will probably visit again. I have a man named Franklin who shakes my hand carefully because he doesn't want to overwhelm me, and a woman named Adele who holds on too tight because she is making up for 29 years of not holding on at all. I am letting both of those things be true at the same time. Boyd is serving 22 years. The trust is mine. I still go to work on Tuesdays. Some days that feels like justice. Some days it just feels like what happened. I'm learning that those two things don't always have to be the same.